morning. I would like to welcome everyone to today's event called Innovation Megatrends. And I start by welcoming the two speakers of today, Adi Ioffe, and she's the founder and CEO at Fast Forward Israel, as well as Maria Jansson, and she's the Tech Foresight Strategy Manager at Imperial College, UK. I also introduce myself. My name is Edvaldo Santos, and I'm the Research, Development, and Innovation Director at Ericsson in Brazil. It's important to mention that this is a series of initiatives from our National Industry Confederation Brazil, CNI, as well as the Entrepreneurial Mobilization for Innovation, MEI. And it's also important to encourage the audience to send questions through our YouTube and Facebook chats so that we make it as interactively as possible. And I must say that I was very happy and very impressed to see some of the technologies we as Ericsson have an eye on when it comes to future technology development listed in the so-called table of disruptive technologies. Just to mention one within a few of them, I mean, what we call in Ericsson Internet of Thoughts, which reflects the ability that we, human beings, can control objects by using our brains instead of using joysticks, mouses, or keyboards. And when you project that through the telecommunications network, I mean, that opens up for a series of very disruptive innovations like smart production, assistive technologies for people who have limited mobilities, etc., etc. Well, enough said. Maybe we can start with the questions. And the first question, of course, has to do with the pandemic. And it's a question to please both of you speakers. And the question is, the COVID-19 pandemic has raised unparalleled challenges to the whole society. I wonder, how did it affect the Tech Foresight efforts? What are the most significant changes from your point of view, please? Maybe we can start with Adi, and then we go to Maria.
Hi, everyone, and good morning, and hi from Israel. For me, as a business futurist, the pandemic is another crucial, big disruption. There are people, professional people, that said that the pandemic, after the pandemic, we'll see a new normal. But for me, I'm doing I write in prediction like 14, 15 years, and I work with major companies in Israel, also local and multinational. And I'm saying on every stage that over the last decade, we live in a disrupted reality. And a disrupted reality is something that should change our mindset and change our methodologies in terms of how to predict the future. So for me, the pandemic was another disruption, something that we need to look at, change our methodology again, and to see how it's going to change the future. So it's not something that surprised me in terms of as a professional, because for me also Facebook and iPhone and IoT and AI and BI, every technology is a disruptor. And the pandemic is another one, a serious one, but another one. So maybe later I can expand more about my methodology, but for me, it's another crucial disruption in our lives.
I would agree on that. It's been a quite disruptive period of time, and I think what has been quite interesting talking with businesses and organizations that are interested in the technology that Imperial College London and Imperial Tech Foresight work with, it's also this acceleration as well that I think has started, and we know now the kind of gap of not being able to work remotely, where people said it's not possible to have remote workers, has suddenly seemed to almost disappear. And I think that kind of things has happened within other industries. You look at, I was speaking to a colleague who's a clinician in telehealth, and he was talking about, I've been for years talking about wearables and people doing their consultations online via video, but there's always seemed to be a barrier from the NHS. And now suddenly that has all been released due to the acceleration. But I think from a tech foresight effort and perspective, it's actually a quite tricky one too, because I've heard from some of my colleagues and in more consultancy fields that people have come to them and asked, well, you're a foresight strategist or you're a futurist. Why didn't you think that this would happen? Why didn't you tell us? And what's really interesting is if you look back at a lot of futures work, people have referenced the risk of pandemics, but they have not seemed to be as high likelihood as they obviously were. So I think the idea of talking about it as, I don't know if you've seen this idea as well, but as gray rhinos. So something that might now give birth to more weak signals and more ideas emerging. I think that's a quite interesting thing. And even looking back, I think Tech Foresight 5 years ago had these cards, these disruption cards. And one of the disruption cards was actually the risk of a pandemic within that as well.
Yeah. If I can add, for me as a futurist, I don't deal with the tactics, disruptions themselves. I try to look ahead on consumer megatrends. It's not even technology. It's about consumer megatrends and try to understand where they are heading. And I cannot predict. I always say also to my students, because I teach in the academy in Israel, and I always say to my students, we cannot predict the tactics. We don't know if there is an entrepreneur sitting in Tel Aviv now inventing the future, but we know the mega trends. And we know that if we'll bring the right product that fits the mega trend, then the magic will happen. And I agree that one of the mega trends are remote. It's about distancing. So every concept, every technology that fits to the remote mega trend will work. I think those are the relationship between consumers and technology.
I would, go on, Edvaldo.
No, please go ahead. I mean, I feel that you have a compliment to say, please.
No, but I agree with that. You can never predict the future. I'm at completely the same idea around that. We have this, and I'll speak about the disruptive table of technologies before, and really what that is for is really imagining future potential. It's not about saying this is the future that will happen. And it also doesn't really take in consideration some of those ethical consequences of some of the technologies, which I think is a really important piece of the puzzle as you're discussing new events or new happenings that are spurring on now. Like, what are the secondary, third level consequences that come up? And we've seen some of those discussions now around surveillance technology, for example, with a kind of rebellious against facial recognition, for example, but also the risks around some of those contact tracing systems that have just been taken out of play because they've realized that the privacy risks were too high.
Exactly. It raises a lot of issues of personal of privacy. Yeah.
Well, fantastic.
We can talk for hours, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we will continue talking for hours after the webinar, I'm sure about that. And I have a second question to Adi. I mean, you constantly say that we should look at today's disrupted world through different lenses. And we wonder, what are the ones you're using today to connect the dots and predict trends before everybody else? I mean, how does that work? How could you tell us about your methodology and briefly share some insights from your book next, please?
Yeah, so my methodology is taking under consideration that the disruption is here. And it means that we need to change as I said before, we need to change our mindset. And what is our traditional mindset? The traditional mindset says that we can predict something that we met before, something that happened before. So every time I look like the year before, and I take another like 2%, 3%, 5%, and I say, oh, my projection for next year is something from before, from the past, plus something that I put now. And the thing is that in the disrupted world, we don't have past experiences. And this is a very important notion. Facebook never happened before. The pandemic never happened before. E-commerce never happened before. So how can I predict the future if nothing never happened before? And we can see it really strongly now in the pandemic, when we see scientists, famous scientists, don't know how to predict the future of the pandemic, because their mindset is very traditional mindset. Science thinks like a traditional scientist. They need to know this pandemic before in order to predict the future. And they have no past experience, so they don't know how to do it. So I suggest in my methodology to take the past and to switch it with the present, and to look what's happening now, not what happened 2 years ago. Because if I'll ask you today how people are going to use social media or wearable or retail or I don't know, everything, actually I don't know, because it's never happened before. So I need new glasses, and my new glasses is to map in different ways the things that are happening now. I call this this methodology the three circles overview. It means that every category, every industry got a few circles that impact their businesses. It's not just the core business. It's not like if I look on retail, for example, I have the retail itself, so I can see what's happening in the retail technology, retail concepts, new business models, etc. But I can also look on other industries like social media, different industries that can impact the retail industry. So if I expand my point of view, I can see more things that I never looked before, and I think those assumptions are more relevant to this current reality, and I think some of them are more can make us more accurate assumptions about the future. It's not just about silo. It's not about a silo look on industry. It's not just about, okay, let's see competitors in different countries. Banking, for example. If I don't know that Google got a license to be a bank, my prediction about banking is not relevant. And Google is not a bank. It's a technology company. So I need to know more about more industries and how they're going to impact my industry in the future. And I think that those are the mains.
All right. Any comments from your side, Maria?
I'm just fascinated with the methodology. Do you have any examples of how you use it and how you help organizations really shift their minds? Because that's something that I know, at least with dealing with technology, it can sometimes be a barrier of that mindset.
Okay, so first, thank you for this. It's a real compliment. I wrote a book that published in Hebrew in Israel a year ago before the pandemic, and we just uploaded an English version on Amazon, so it's there for the full version. But the thing is, I think that the retail is a very good example, the traditional retail. And I can give you an example here in Israel. It was a very fascinating one. So we looked on in order to understand the future of malls, for example. So the traditional thinking is about mapping some data and concepts regarding malls, and then we went to another circles, and another circle related to e-commerce and new technologies regarding e-commerce, and the third circle was really fascinating because we saw that another category, not related at all to the malls, but in Israel it was so fascinating to see. There was a regulation, a new regulation on flight abroad. So prices decreased regarding going abroad, and more Israeli went abroad to buy things that they didn't bought in Israel. So it's actually changed the future of malls. So traditionally, you won't look at all about how people are going abroad to buy things instead of going to your mall. So traditionally you look on different malls, different competitors. So what I'm trying to do with my customers is to bring them the notion and to give them the I don't know how to call it, the mindset that there are different industries that are impacting them, and it's really, really hard. I agree that it's really, really hard because managers are really used to look on their core business and their core competitors, but their core competitors will not be the future competitor. So this is the story.
It's interesting because we usually work with, so Igor Ansov was like a management theorist in the 50s. You probably heard of him, and he coined the ideas around weak signal theory. So weak signals are emerging signals of change that are weak, or you don't think they will have an impact of your business. But that's essentially how we think about it as well, is that you have the core. So if you're looking at one area, that's the core, and then that's the adjacent, which people normally know about, like you said, well, malls, they know about e-commerce, or they know about direct to consumer, but they might not know about this kind of other circle, which could be live streaming something. So it's a really interesting concept to use, really to change that frame and say, well, that could be the next billion-dollar industry that actually completely impacts your organization, but you can't say that it will yet, but you have to almost create your own early warning system around keeping a track of what's happening with that industry in case it does.
I always say that the futurist is half psychologist, because whenever you show the future to a business director or owner, they are saying, no, it's not going to happen. It's, so half of the job is to try to show people that it could be, and it should be very to do it in very sensitive way.
Exactly. Do you do a lot of future prototyping as well? Because that's something that we do sometimes, that we prototype what that future might look like in case that weak signal completely accelerates.
Yeah. No, I don't use this methodology. We use it as a starter for innovation processes. So we try to draw the North Star for a company, and then we're trying to think about to make some ideation process and try to start an innovation process for a company.
Well, your comments inspires me to put an extra question here. I mean, with the people you talk to, I mean, digitalization, I mean, the pandemic has basically forced digitalization. And I was wondering, when you talk to your peers, your customers, your research peers, et cetera, how do they see digitalization in general? Is it something they are really eager to embrace, or is it something they are afraid of?
Maria?
Is that for me?
Yeah, for both of you.
I think depending on, I mean, there's always a risk when you're trying something new. So again, like talking about working with academics, I would say at Imperial, most of the academics have been very positive, but it also obviously has its challenges. If you're a lecturer and you have to do 50% learning in a completely different manner. But I think what I've heard so far, it's been mainly positive. And I think it's what's interesting if you think about it as what is the consequence of this remote working or this digitization? You can also start talking about like tech migration. Maybe we won't be focusing on Tel Aviv, Sao Paulo, or London, but actually this will then unburden some of the urbanized environments where you can see people maybe moving outside. So you're already seeing some of that move in, for example, Silicon Valley, where there are people now moving to smaller cities in the US, for example. But that's not really answering your question. But I think in terms of digitization, especially at Imperial College London, we've already been quite on the forefront on things like lab digitization. So we have one of the first robotic labs called ROAR, which is Rapid Online Analysis and Synthesis Lab, which is completely done by robotics. But it also is aiming to, in the future, being able to dial a molecule. So, for example, in 5 years, our researchers are hoping that you will put in the characteristics of a certain molecule and you'll be able to just receive it in the lab. So for them, they see it as a positive because they'll be able to have more time to spend on creativity, innovation, the actual important work, rather than some of the kind of repetitive lab work. And it's the same with individuals I've spoken to working in areas such as computational chemistry, for example. Yeah. Does it answer your question?
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, in Israel, I can say that we see a lot of the digital, as Maria said before, really accelerate a lot of industries. One of the dominant one is the education sector here in Israel, because there was a lot of talks all over the years that the education should jump another step and be digital, and suddenly it's a must-have tool. Now we are going to a quarantine, so my kids, for example, they got messages that they are going to study by Zoom or remotely, whatever, and there are a lot of talks about how to give or how to gain new skills for children. So the education system really changed their attitude. So it's not about, a teacher standing in a class, writing on a board. It's about what is the role of the education system in 2020. And I think in that term, it's really important. So the pandemic did something good. I don't know if I can say that, but it's really accelerates some industries.
I fully agree. I have an additional question, and that's to Maria. And the Imperial College has recently launched the marvelous, in my personal point of view, table of disruptive technologies.
Yep.
How did you come up with these 100 potential disruptive technologies that can change the world in the coming 20 years? And what are the ones you would highlight, and for what reason, please?
So the story is we actually invented the table of disruptive technologies about 2 years ago. And we came up with it when one of my colleagues came across an emerging technology list. We said, this doesn't feel right. Like, there's so many things missing from the conversations we're having with academics daily, from the kind of conferences we do and the conversations we have. So what we did is we started up making our own list, and we started thinking, like, what are some really interesting, inspiring, and thought-provoking technologies that might really have an impact on both society, both now and a bit later. And Anna Kopani, who I worked with at that time, she's a chemist. So she thought, well, actually, it would be really interesting if we made it look like a periodic table. So if you look at the shape of it, it looks exactly like a periodic table almost. So we started putting it into that space just to make it easy for people to see. And then there is the vector of potential economic disruption, socioeconomic disruption. And then on the bottom, it's the kind of sooner and then later. And we started putting Post-its on the different places and started discussing both with industry, but as well as with academic collaborators about, what do you think? Where should these different things be? And we had some quite interesting conversations where we had someone saying, well, autonomous vehicles, they're already ubiquitous in society. And we're like, no, they're not. We can agree on that. And it's quite interesting because you start seeing when someone is really deep into a technological area, they actually think that the timeline of when things will happen is often quite sooner. So having that question of, well, what is the barrier? Why has it not happened yet? Or what has been the kind of experience of this in the past? So we're sort of doing a little bit different from you, Adi, in terms of that in really expanding and thinking about that technology. And in the end, what we ended up with was this table, which we then had a collaborator called Gabby Lee, who helped us do all the companies, not all of them, but some of the companies that are working within those technologies as well. For me, I might be going, excuse me if I talk quite quickly, I'm quite excited about this. For me, some of the most important technologies on the table still today are climate impact technologies. So technologies that help us create more environmentally friendly society in different ways, whether that is distributed smart grids that's mentioned on there, factory photosynthesis, which is basically artificial photosynthesis to take carbon from air and actually clean our cities, to creating better batteries and mega desalination as well. Those are really important questions. And I think anything that has to do with the kind of sustainable development goals in terms of creating a better world for the many in the next couple of years will be the most important for me. But then we also have the kind of side around autonomous technologies and what that will mean for us as humans, as we start maybe having an AI as our colleague, or maybe we work within a distributed autonomous organization where there are smart contracts in place and where we don't have a manager because middle management might have disappeared at that point, and we might have an AI board member that can increase and discuss other questions than we as humans can do. And I think that kind of technology will have a different impact. And there's obviously different risks there as well, but also different opportunities. Like what if we already, a couple of months ago, had proper robotic care companions within the pandemic? Could that help with some of the challenges around health, for example? So I think there are many technologies to highlight, but those are some of them.
It's really interesting because for me, when I look on consumer megatrends, I see exactly the same, just from the side of consumers. So the automation and what I call the passive consumer. So consumers they don't know that they want to be passive, but they adopt everything that makes them be passive and lazy, and this is the other side of technology that makes things automatically. And if I have time, I want to tell you another story. Every year on December, I write an annual trend prediction for the coming year. And last December, before the pandemic, I wrote an interesting report. And I call it the future of re-owning. And I saw that people want to re-own, talking about weak signals. I thought that people would like to re-own their reality and to change their future. And this is why, for me, as I look at reality, this is why we see a lot of activism, political activism, climate activism, a lot of activism, because I believe that people want to change their future. And it's really interesting to see that the sustainable technology connected in so many ways in the willingness of people to change. So it must be together, and it's a big story. It's about lack of trust, and okay, we don't go into it now, but it's really interesting.
It sounds really interesting, especially combining it. So on the table, we talk about distributed ledgers. If you actually give more of a choice for each consumer or each citizen in actually what's happening within their local government in terms of governance through better technology systems, then that can actually allow for some of that realization of, I feel like I own my local government politics, for example.
Interesting.
I like very much what you say, and if I can come to one of these 100 technologies to put my contribution on that, I mean, these non-intrusive interfaces between computers and our human brains, I mean, that has a huge potential in my personal opinion. And the whole society might think of production, so to say, smart industries, etc., etc. But I think we need to overemphasize the potential for what we call technology for good, meaning that we transform the way we live, and then we use technology for assistive type of technologies. As an example, again, I mean, having these robotic arms to support people with deficiencies, paralysis, movement limitations, etc., etc. So we can project and imagine the height in the standard of living of Stephen Hawking, one of the most intelligent persons that we have ever, experienced in his history, if such type of technologies would have been available in the 20th century. So, and this is fantastic. Well, maybe we can go to an additional question, and I already said that it's twofold, and it's for both of you, please. How do Imperial College and Fast Forward help companies define their innovation strategies using Tech Foresight methodologies? Please share some examples. And the second part, the CNI audience is very plural. Here we have policymakers, opinion makers, company heads, etc., etc. So what would you recommend to Brazilian companies planning to be globally competitive, please?
Maria?
I can start. It's fine. You can start if you want to. I don't mind. Okay. So at Imperial College, or rather at Imperial Tech Foresight, because we're the Foresight practice within Imperial College London, we basically say that we help organizations think a little bit beyond and probe some of that technology hype. So if someone says AI, we're like, but what does that mean? And what can that actually be applied for in the next 5, 10, 15 years? And then we use the depth of academic knowledge and scientific rigor to really unpack what it could mean. So really it is about creating, we think about it as, what are some of the more plausible futures that might come up from this technology in terms of consequences, but what are some of the second and third layer, a bit of what we talked about before. And what we often challenge organizations when they come to us and we talk about the future is if they come to us and say, we are a company that only work on this, we often challenge them to bring in presentations or discussions with academics that talk about something completely different. So for example, if we have a natural resource company coming in, we might bring in someone who talks about mining water on the moon through space mining, because that might open a new opportunity on land. Or we might take someone in from a design and product development perspective who thinks about material resources in a completely different manner. But an example of what we've done before is we do timelines and infographics, and we've actually done that for some organizations as well. And one of them is on our website as well, which is called The Future of Water, where we looked at social, environmental, political, economical, and technological shifts across those different layers of the more possible, plausible, and probable futures. And what we did was we took in academics into those co-creation sessions with industry, where we really thought about what could happen if this happened. And we had about I think it was a 2-day session where we looked at that and then designed a future timeline for them. And it's not a timeline where we say this will happen, because we really believe in working with those more uncertain parts of reality in a way, or of what might happen. So for example, one of the ideas was using cloud harvesting technology for water. It has started happening, but what would that mean for a water company that works with infrastructure, water infrastructure primarily? It could completely disrupt them if everything becomes decentralized and people actually can collect their water from thin air. So that's how we work. I think in terms of Brazilian companies planning to be globally competitive, I think it's really important to think about what is the future you want to create? What is the future you're working in? What is the time horizon as well? Are you looking to do things that might impact the next 20 years, the next 5 years? And also be aware of what's happening in other countries and other regions to see it, like, where would my competitive set be if I go in there? And more than anything, how would you, if you come up with future ideas or future visions or scenarios that you've developed, then how do you implement those ideas? Maybe test it, maybe prototype it and drive it forward and do something small in those markets. But I would really recommend to think about weak signals and some of those uncertain futures. I mean, we're in a very ambiguous time at the moment, so it's really important to be open for what the future might be.
Thank you. For me, for us in Israel, what we actually do is trying to map the future map of businesses. We try to look on the current reality and try to map all the influences, direct and indirect, that we can imagine, and try to map how this business is going to look like 5-10 years from now. And it's really difficult. It's a really difficult mission to do to traditional businesses that used to think in a certain way and used to live dozens of years in a certain reality. And the challenge is to try to forecast the changes that are going to influence on those businesses and trying to map the north for them, and then go back and try to see what we need to do now in order to go there. So there are different strategies. We can make innovation. We can invest on startups. Israel is the startup nation, so we have a lot of innovation here. We can cooperate with other businesses. We can change our business model. There are a lot of plenty things to do. But the first thing is to map the future for the business. And I also believe, and I said it before, that the only thing that we know in certain, those are the megatrends. So if we are updated with the relevant megatrends, could be technological, could be economy, demographic, political, consumer, whatever they are, we know on megatrends that they can start here and they can end on other industries. It's like personalization, it's like automation, it's like direct to consumer. The megatrend is a very force tool that can help us predict the future for each business. And the second thing, and here I really agree with Maria, it's about what we call in futurism the weak signals. It's about mapping all the time. I always say to my clients and to my students and to people to my audience, I always say, take a note on your iPhone or on your Ericsson, and whatever mobile you have. Take a note, and every time you see something new, it could be a new technology, it could be a new concept, new business model, put it on this note. After a few weeks, you'll have this weak signals list. You have a lot of information, and the thing is to be your own futurist. Your own for your personal matters and for your business matters, and the thing is to be curious and to be updated, and this is part of the secret sauce, I think, of people like us. And for the Brazilian companies, Brazil is one of the advantages of Brazil is being one of the biggest country in the world. So you have like 200 million people, right? This is the number. So there is a super extra field to make prototypes, new innovations. You can gain a lot of data. You can use these millions of people to see how they react with technology and to see how this technology impact their lives. And you can give this information, this experience to other markets. And I think it's a huge advantage for you.
Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to see many questions coming from the audience so that
Yes.
we can make it as interactive as we wanted it to be. And then I start with a tricky one, which is how to change professionals' mindsets in a disruptive world if the undergraduate and graduate courses are mostly based on traditional old-fashioned teaching learning methodology.
How we can change professional mindset? Just a second.
Yeah, it has to do with education. I mean, how can we change professionals' mindset if graduates...
I can move to Brazil and make... I think that the secret sauce is about really taking the right people that have this new mindset that relevant to this disruption era, and to use new methodologies and to put those methodologies in an organization in each department. It's not just about, it's not a privilege. We used to, to bring some talks to the management, to the board of directors, and we said, okay, they should know where the future is heading. And I'm saying that every person, every professional should know where the future is heading. And every organization should invest those time and effort in order to give those new skills to every professional in this organization. This is my thought.
Yeah, continuous learning, right? Maria, any contributions from your side?
I agree. I think it's one of those areas of almost unlearning some of the previous methodologies that we have learned, and then sort of learning to challenge yourself and kill your darlings. And I think one of the ways of doing that is even make sure that if you have new starters that come from new places that have not worked in your industry before, make sure to talk to them. What do you see as the biggest risk to my industry? Be sure to talk to the 20-year-olds that might not have started, because they don't know enough about how the industry works to actually see the opportunities. Because I think sometimes the kind of professional knowledge or some of the things that have been traditional taught into us is this is what we need to believe, because if A happens, then B comes next. You can learn to rethink that if you invite in those people for the right conversations. And we worked on, in my previous position where I worked for an innovation company, we actually did some work on creating foresight ambassadors within a large organization. And one of the things there was like, it doesn't matter which level or if they're a manager or not, but it's about thinking. It's about getting the right people into a room and thinking about the future together. Because if you start thinking about the future, start talking about the future or future impact, then what happens then is you start noticing the future around you, which is quite strange. But if you start looking at the disruptive table, for example, and say, well, I know that on there it talks about smart grids, then suddenly you'll start seeing every news thing that comes up about smart grids is sort of reinstating your bias. And I think that's the challenge as well. We need to work to unlearn some of our unconscious biases around the future and what will come next. And another thing, I'm going to say one more thing and then I'll stop, is around really thinking about visualizing what that future might be. So I think that's also a really nice tools. They did this study in Princeton around 20-year-olds imagining the future of the future of when they get a pension. And there was they put them in an MRI scan and said, imagine the future. And what they saw was an actor. So like the same kind of part of their brain that lit up when they thought about an actor lit up. But then they created almost like a visual of how they might look like in the future. And again, they were sent into this MRI scan to look at their brain and like, think about yourself in the future. And suddenly that part of the brain lit up. So I think the kind of idea of visualizing and creating a rich narrative about the future can help us imagine how it might impact us.
Which also touches on diversity. I mean, the importance of plural thoughts and diversity, but we can take that any other day because we have many questions here. And the second one would be, can we talk about trends when we are immersed on continuous discontinuity? How can we distinguish real trends that worth focus on from noise?
I'll take this. So as I said, I really like, also the title of this session is about megatrends. So I try to elaborate more about what is a megatrend. So a megatrend is a trend that impacts more than one category at the same time. So if we can actually see the impact of megatrends on different categories. So if we can see this megatrend, we know it's a megatrend. It's not a tactic. It's not something that comes and goes. So if we see megatrends like direct to consumer, for example, automation, for example, we can see those, like when the pandemic started on March in Israel, I wrote a map of trends, 4 trends that I predicted they are going to be the trends of the pandemic. And one of them I called the remote. It's a mega trend. Remote, it's a mega trend. We work remotely, we study remotely, we make sport remotely, we do a lot of things remotely. So this is something that we know it's a mega trend, and and within we can innovate a lot of concepts and new things. And this is I think this is the difference between something like, a small thing and a big thing, a big theme like a mega trend. For example, another one is localization. We see in the pandemic that instead of being global, we became more local. So it's a mega trend. It impacts a lot of things. It's about the impact on industry, the manufacturing itself. It's about being with my own community. It's about buying from small businesses. This is the mega trend, and those are the small things. Small, it's not the small, but the small things that behind this mega trend. I hope I explained it well.
I believe so. Can we jump to another question? There was one here which talks about weak signals of innovation, which I believe has been answered already. So I go for another one, which is, when we talk about disruptive technologies, how to consider the roadmap to get results? I mean, how to evaluate time to get positive results? You me?
I'm trying to figure out what the question means. I'm sorry. So if this is about how disruptive technologies and how to get positive results or net gain or benefits from it, I think it's about...
And the time perspective. Well.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people, what we've seen is a lot of people have actually used the disruptive table for their business. So they looked at the different technologies and they thought, if this technology existed in my industry, what would this look like? And I think going back to this kind of idea of weak signals and understanding some of those impacts that can go into your business, it helps people say, well, this is how it could look for in my industry. This is how it can, if this looked like this, it could have this kind of impact on me. In terms of getting positive results, it was not created as a map of income and gain. It was created as an thought-provoking experiment to get people thinking about disruptive technologies. And it's 2 years old, so there might be things that have moved up. So in there we mention RNA vaccines, which have obviously moved up in the necessity and need, for example. And it's a continuously evolving document, similar to what Adi talked about with the innovation megatrends. These are not static things. And I think that's important to know. You can't just say, well, I managed it 6 months ago, so I never need to talk about the future again in my organization. It's about a continuous iterative process, about rethinking and reimagining what your business needs to be in that kind of continuously evolving world. Whoever answered the question, I hope I answered the question. Okay.
All right. There is another question here that puts us back to the pandemic. And the question is, what kind of mega trends will, in your opinion, have the greatest impact post-pandemic?
Okay, tricky one. Okay, so I'll say few. So as I said, remote. I think people are going to change the way they are going to work, even after the pandemic. Education is also going to be influenced by these remote things. I think that we should look on home and the functionality of home. I think people are really discovering what happened in their home, because we used to go in the morning and go back in the evening, and now we are having, a lot of time at home. So everything there is going to change. This is something that I'm looking at. Future of work in general, it's not just about remote. It's not just about working from home. It's about the future of work and the economic situation and what's going to be there. There is an interesting prediction that I wrote in the end of 2017, and I call it the future of pieces. And I meant that everything is being cut to pieces, to small pieces, like we see in a story of Instagram or TikTok or everything. So I think that the future of work is going to be cut into pieces. So people will not work in one place or 100% place. It's going to be cut, and it's going to change and going to challenge technologies also, because how I'm going to manage my life if I'm working in 5 different places. So this is also an area that I'm looking at. And the thing with what's going to be the future of physical spaces, streets, retail stores, malls, hotels, restaurants, the physical, what is the relationship between us and hygiene places, all those, this area is something that I believe going to be really interesting. And another thing to finalize my ideas is that the thing that I think that the one thing that the pandemic showed very well is that there is no replace for humanity. And I think it's really strong. We are talking a lot about technology, but I think that people are really missing a hug, really missing being with other people. And I think that this is also going to challenge in so many ways the technology innovations. So those are my thoughts.
We have time for...
Can I ask?
Sorry, please, your take.
I think a really interesting point on the kind of idea of low-touch economies, low touch in terms of being connected with people. We've been seeing a lot of sensorial technologies come out, and I know actually Ericsson did a Internet of the Senses a while back, which they released as well. But we've been also seeing a lot of academics working on things like wearables that are in the shape of fabrics. So you have much more haptics. We've been seeing things like new technologies that just, I know you can't replace real life, but that has does not create this kind of idea of Zoom fatigue, essentially. And within that, there is also a really interesting stream that I don't think we mentioned that much before, but the kind of prevalence of mental health and the issue around mental health really increasing globally.
Yeah.
And I think an importance for companies to also think about where they situate themselves within that. So we have academics within the college working around design psychology, which is essentially imagining the way different interventions are around technology to make them positive towards mental health. So, for example, they've developed a VR headset that help people who might stutter in anxious situations, for example. So I think that kind of side will be really interesting. I know it's not an innovation megatrend, but I think it's an outcome of a megatrend around mental health, where we're seeing where can we maybe look at reshaping our reality with technology? Because if this is a remote reality, what are some of the new interventions we will need to create to make that a positive experience? And I like the idea of remote and decentralization as well. So we have academics that are working on things such as disinfectants and thinking about, can that be made even locally at the hospital, so we don't even have to worry about shipping it across the globe. And I think those kind of new tactics, as you would probably say, Adi, will be even more prevalent because of those cases and risks to the situation.
Yeah, since you touched upon Internet of Senses, yes, we in Ericsson work with that a lot. And to make a long story short, I mean, that's heavily based on artificial intelligence within what we call responsible artificial intelligence, ethical artificial intelligence, which is something that really concerns the society as a whole. And we have room for a last question, which is, and it's something we appreciate and like a lot, which is innovation megatrends are more likely to happen in climate change, sustainability, energy generation, consumer behavior, and activism. And the question is, yes or no, is this interpretation correct?
There are some more megatrends. Consumer behavior, it's not a megatrend. It's the theme of the megatrends of consumer behavior. There are several megatrends that related to consumer behavior. So mainly, if people want to see the whole megatrends, they can go to my website or to read my book or to read the list. But the main consumer behaviors now are, as I said, it's automation, personalization, remote, re-owning. Those are the biggest and the most relevant.
Any comments, Maria?
I think this was more a question for Adi, so I don't have I have one comment that came from what you said before as well around the innovation megatrend around bits and the gig economy and economical uncertainty. I think we need to all be aware of the kind of ambiguity for a lot of consumers that will be facing them in the next couple of years, essentially.
Yeah.
Fantastic. With that, I really, really thank you both, Adi and Maria, for a very inspirational talk here within the CNI event. And I hope it encourages not only myself, but the whole audience to get to know more about the work that you both perform, and very especially how we individually, as well as the companies we represent and we work for, prepare for the future. So any final words from your side?
No, thank you for having us. It was really a fascinating discussion. Here in Israel, we are heading the Israeli, the Jewish New Year. So I wish you all a Happy New Year. And thank you, and be healthy and safe. And hope to see you soon in Brazil.
Hope so. Maria?
Similar. Thank you for all the great questions. Thank you for a very interesting conversation. and create your own future, because the future is not stagnant. That's probably the only thing I would say.
Well, on behalf of the National Industry Confederation Brazil, CNI, I thank you all and also the audience for this very relevant event. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.